The broadcast that shouldn't exist. It was 2:17 a.m. when Ethan Graves first heard the transmission. He had been working the graveyard shift at KXBR 103.5, a dying late-night radio station on the outskirts of town. The ratings were low, the calls were infrequent, and most of the time it felt like he was talking to no one. But that night, as he was preparing to wrap up the broadcast, his radio console flickered. The usual playlist glitched, and the station's frequency changed on its own. The red light on the soundboard blinked wildly before settling on a new frequency, 87.9 FM. That frequency should have been empty, and yet, through the speakers, a distorted voice crackled to life. "If you can hear this, it's already too late." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He glanced at the station's logs. No one was broadcasting on 87.9. No one had ever been assigned to it. Then, the voice returned. "He's coming for you, Ethan." His name. Ethan's breath hitched. His fingers trembled as he reached for the volume knob, but before he could turn it down, the signal distorted. The static twisted into something that sounded like screaming. Then, silence. The frequency cut out. The console shut down completely. Ethan sat in stunned silence, the only sound in the room the faint hum of dead air. What the hell just happened? The signal from nowhere. The next morning, Ethan called his boss, Charlie Reynolds, the station manager. "An unauthorized frequency hijacked our signal last night," Ethan said, gripping the phone tightly. Whoever it was, said my name." There was a long pause. Then Charlie sighed. "Ethan," he said slowly, "we shut down our overnight programming at 2 a.m. Ethan felt his stomach drop. "That's impossible. I was here, I heard it." "No, you didn't. The transmitter powers off at 2 a.m. sharp. There was no signal for anyone to hijack." Ethan's blood ran cold. If the station had been off the air, then what the hell had he been listening to? The lost recording. Determined to prove what he had heard, Ethan checked the station's recorded logs. Every broadcast was automatically archived. But when he scrolled to 2:17 a.m., the system glitched. The playback was wrong. Instead of the Eerie broadcast, the archive contained only distorted whispers and a sound that resembled wet breathing, as if something was inside the station. Then a voice, barely audible, spoke directly into the mic. "Don't listen. Don't let him in." A cold sweat broke across Ethan's forehead. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't anyone's. And then, the file deleted itself. The first victim. The following night, Ethan's co-worker Mark Carson took over the shift. Ethan warned him about what had happened, but Mark laughed it off. At 2:17 a.m., Ethan's phone rang. It was Mark. "Ethan," he whispered, "something's wrong. The signal is—" The call cut out. Ethan rushed to the station. When he arrived, the front door was unlocked. Inside, the radio console was still running, but Mark was gone. His headset lay on the desk, the mic still hot. From the speakers, a faint scratching sound echoed through the empty room. And then, the distorted voice returned. "You should have listened." Mark was never seen again. The dead frequency. After Mark's disappearance, Ethan became obsessed. He dug through every old record he could find, trying to trace the origins of 87.9 FM. What he found made no sense. According to FCC records, the frequency had never been assigned to any station, but in 1974, a pirate radio station known as Wraith Radio had attempted to broadcast from that exact frequency. The DJ, Howard Lane, went missing on air. His last words? "If you can hear this, it's already too late." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the old newspaper reports. The station had been abandoned for decades, yet somehow the signal was still broadcasting. Chapter 6. The Final Transmission. Ethan knew he had to shut it down. Armed with a frequency jammer, he returned to the station at 2:17 a.m. The radio console was already active, its dials twisting on their own. The signal was waiting for him. He placed the jammer on the console and activated it. The room shook as the signal fought back. From the speakers, the voice screamed, "Don't stop listening!" The power flickered. The air grew heavy, and then a figure emerged from the static, tall, shadowy, faceless. It reached for Ethan. He slammed his hand down on the power switch. The station went dark. Epilogue. The ghost frequency. The station never broadcasted again. Mark was never found. The police ruled it a vanishing case, and the town slowly forgot about KXBR 103.5. Ethan left town, trying to escape the nightmare that had taken everything from him, but he could never outrun it. Years later, in a city miles away, he was driving late at night when his radio suddenly flickered. The station tuned itself to 87.9 FM. And through the static, a whisper echoed, "He's still listening." Ethan's breath hitched. Then the signal went silent. But Ethan knew the truth. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Somewhere, in the dead of night. The broadcast continues. Frequency 109.7. Miles Carter had spent most of his life surrounded by radio frequencies. As an audio engineer, he had worked on everything from commercial radio stations to underground pirate broadcasts. He thought he had heard it all, until the night he stumbled upon frequency 109.7. It was past midnight when he first found it. He had been scanning for an unused frequency to test some new broadcasting equipment when he heard the whisper. "Can you hear me?" The voice was faint, almost lost beneath layers of static. Miles adjusted the frequency, trying to clean up the signal. But the more he tweaked it, the worse it became. A second voice joined in, then a third. Soon the radio was filled with overlapping whispers, as if an entire crowd was trying to speak at once. Then, through the chaos, one phrase stood out clearly. "He is listening." Miles reached for the dial, intending to turn it off. But the radio wouldn't shut down. The static grew louder, the whispers turning into distorted screams. The speakers crackled, emitting a high-pitched noise that sent a sharp pain through his skull. And then, silence. The frequency was gone, as if it had never existed. The next morning, Miles couldn't shake what had happened. He searched online for any records of frequency 109.7, but found nothing. It didn't exist. No licensed station had ever broadcasted on that frequency. Determined to uncover the truth, Miles reached out to an old friend, Elliot Grayson, a radio historian who specialized in forgotten broadcasts. When he mentioned the frequency, Elliot went quiet. "Miles," he finally said, "where did you hear that signal?" Miles hesitated. "On my scanner last night." Elliot took a deep breath. "I don't know how to tell you this, but that's impossible. 109.7 was shut down 40 years ago." Miles frowned. "Why?" There was an independent station, WZEB. It was small, locally run. But one night, in 1984, during a late-night broadcast, everyone inside the station vanished. Miles's stomach tightened. Vanished? They were never found. The only evidence left behind was a recording of the final broadcast. Elliot hesitated. And Miles? The last words on that recording were, "He is listening." Miles knew he had to hear the recording for himself. After some convincing, Elliot agreed to meet him at his archive, where he kept rare and forgotten radio transmissions. As they sat in a dimly lit room, Elliot placed an old cassette into a player. The tape clicked, and a distorted voice crackled through the speakers. At first, it was just standard radio chatter, an old DJ introducing songs, taking calls. Then, about 20 minutes in, everything changed. The DJ's voice wavered. Folks, we seem to be picking up some interference. Strange. I don't see any storms on the radar." Then came the whispers. Dozens of them, overlapping, frantic. Then, one clear phrase, He is listening. The DJ chuckled nervously. Okay, this is weird. Anyone out there messing with our frequency? A moment of silence. Then, a new voice, deep, hollow. Stop listening. The recording cut to static. Miles exhaled, his skin crawling. That's it? He asked. Elliot shook his head. There's one more second of audio at the very end, but no one has ever been able to make out what it says. It's too distorted. Miles had an idea. He pulled out his laptop and ran the final second through audio cleaning software. Slowly, he filtered out the static, enhancing the voice. The words became clearer, and then, "He knows your name, Miles." Miles froze. The room went cold. Elliot's face drained of color. That's impossible. Then the radio in the corner, which had been turned off, suddenly crackled to life. Stop listening. Miles barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whispers, hundreds of voices, all whispering his name. By morning, he knew what he had to do. He had to find the station. Using old records and maps, he tracked down the last known location of WZEB. It was still there, an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, covered in vines and decay. No one had set foot inside for decades. Miles hesitated at the door, then stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old electronics. The broadcast equipment was still intact, frozen in time. And in the center of the room, the microphone was on. A small red light blinked. Someone, or something, was still broadcasting. Chapter 5. The Entity. Miles approached the microphone, heart pounding. The speakers crackled. And then, the voice returned. "Miles, why did you come?" The room grew dark. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Then, from the static, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body flickering like an old television signal, and its face, number. It had no face. No face, only a void. Then, the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Join us." Miles turned and ran. As he reached the exit, the walls warped, shifting into endless hallways. The station was changing, trapping him inside. The entity reached for him. Miles grabbed the nearest piece of equipment and smashed the radio console. The static screamed. Then, silence. The building collapsed into darkness. Miles woke up outside. The station was gone. No ruins, no debris, as if it had never existed. Epilogue. The signal never fades. Miles never spoke about what happened that night. But sometimes, late at night, he turned on his radio and scanned the frequencies. And every once in a while, he heard whispers, and a single phrase that made his blood run cold. He is still listening. Daniel Carter had been a late-night radio host for over a decade. His show, Midnight Echoes, specialized in chilling tales, urban legends, and eerie call-ins from listeners who swore they'd encountered the paranormal. It was a modest gig at an aging AM station, but it paid the bills. That night, the station was dimly lit, the on-air sign glowing red outside the booth. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the equipment and the occasional static from the old receiver. It was 2:37 a.m., and Daniel had just finished reading a story about a haunted motel when the phone line crackled to life. "You're on Midnight Echoes with Daniel Carter," he said, sipping his coffee. "What's your story?" A deep static buzzed through the line, followed by heavy breathing. Then a whisper. "Daniel. He's listening." Daniel sat up straight. "Who's listening?" The line went dead. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Prank calls were common, but something about the voice unsettled him. It sounded strained, almost desperate. He shook it off, playing a pre-recorded segment while trying to steady his nerves. But then, the printer in the booth suddenly whirred to life. Daniel frowned. He hadn't printed anything. Slowly, a sheet of paper slid out. The message was typed in a jagged, uneven font. "He knows you hear him." The following night, Daniel returned to the station with an uneasy feeling. His producer, Mark, laughed it off. "Probably just a fan messing with you," Mark said, adjusting the soundboard. "People get weird with these paranormal shows." Daniel nodded, but something felt off. As the show progressed, another call came in. The number was blocked. He hesitated, then answered. "Daniel, help me." It was the same voice, a whisper, barely audible over the static. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, gripping the mic. A long silence. Then, faintly, "He's watching." The signal cut out. Daniel exhaled sharply, feeling a deep pit in his stomach. His fingers hovered over the station logs, tracing back the call's origin. But the system showed nothing. No record of an incoming call. It was as if no one had spoken to him at all. Then, the printer screeched again. Another message. "Don't look behind you." Daniel's breath caught. Slowly he turned. The booth's glass wall reflected the dim station behind him. But in the reflection, a dark figure stood just outside the door. Daniel spun around. The hallway was empty. He rushed to Mark, his heart pounding. "Did you see anyone outside the booth?" Mark frowned. "No one's here but us." Daniel hesitated, then decided he needed answers. He spent the next day researching the station's history. Hidden in old newspaper archives, he found something chilling. 30 years ago, a former host named Jack Albright had vanished on air. The last words caught on his live broadcast: "He's watching." Daniel's blood ran cold. The next night, Daniel returned, determined to confront the mystery. At exactly 2:37 a.m., the call came again. "Daniel, run!" The static thickened, distorting the voice. But beneath it, another sound emerged, breathing. Not from the caller, but from inside the booth. Daniel turned to the glass. This time, the shadow was inside the room. A handprint formed on the fogged glass of the studio door. The lights flickered. The radio equipment glitched, voices whispering through the speakers in a garbled mess of words. Then, the printer screeched one final message. "You're next." The power cut out. When Mark arrived in the morning, Daniel was gone. The only trace left behind was the looping sound of static on the airwaves, and the faint echo of a whisper. "He's still listening." A broadcast from the past. The KXAM radio station had been abandoned for years. The decaying building sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tangled trees, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the darkness. The rusted transmission tower loomed overhead, an eerie skeleton against the night sky. No one knew exactly when the station had gone silent. Some said the owner had vanished overnight. Others swore they still heard strange broadcasts on its frequency, whispers, distorted music, and chilling voices echoing from a station that wasn't supposed to be on air. Jake Turner, a freelance journalist, had always been drawn to unsolved mysteries, and the legend of KXAM intrigued him. He had read about the station's sudden closure and the strange reports that followed. As a skeptic, he chalked it up to urban legends and faulty radio equipment. But when he tuned in to KXAM's frequency the night before, his blood ran cold. A voice, static-filled and fragmented, had whispered his name. "Jake, we're waiting." He had slammed off the radio, but the words still echoed in his mind. Now, standing in front of the abandoned station, flashlight in hand, he felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. The building was supposed to be empty. So why was there a faint glow coming from inside? Jake pushed open the rusted door, its hinges groaning like a wounded animal. Dust swirled in the dim light of his flashlight, revealing old desks, shattered equipment, and walls covered in yellowed papers. The control room was at the end of the hall. He stepped inside, his breath catching as he saw the broadcast equipment. The console was covered in dust, its knobs and dials untouched for years. The microphone sat eerily upright, as if someone had been using it moments ago. Then, the speakers crackled to life. A distorted voice filled the room. "You came back, finally." Jake stumbled backward, his heart hammering. "This isn't possible," he muttered. The station had no power, no working equipment. Yet the broadcast continued. The voice shifted, becoming layered, multiple voices speaking over each other in a ghostly symphony. One phrase stood out among the chaos. "Don't leave, or he will find you." The radio went silent. Jake swallowed hard. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing against his chest. His rational mind screamed at him to leave, but curiosity anchored him in place. Who was broadcasting? And more importantly, who was he? Determined to find answers, Jake searched the station. In an old filing cabinet, he found a collection of tapes labeled with dates from over 20 years ago. One tape stood out. It was marked, "Final Broadcast, Do Not Play." Ignoring the warning, he placed the tape into the old deck and pressed play. The recording was filled with static at first. Then a voice, calm yet tinged with fear, spoke. "This is Richard Gaines, signing off for the last time. If anyone hears this, I beg you, do not listen to the voices. Do not answer them. Do not stay past midnight." A sharp click, then a new voice cut in. "He's coming." The recording ended abruptly. Jake exhaled, gripping the edge of the desk. He checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. He had 13 minutes before midnight. The air suddenly grew ice cold. The speakers crackled again. This time, it was his own voice. "Jake, you shouldn't have come." The flashlight flickered. A shadow moved in the doorway, and then the lights in the station turned back on. The glow Jake had seen earlier wasn't coming from the control room, it was coming from the transmission tower outside. The old metal structure pulsed with an eerie red light. A deep, inhuman voice rumbled through the speakers. "Stay! Join us!" Jake bolted toward the exit, but the door slammed shut on its own. The floor vibrated beneath him. The station was awakening. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting and warping. The static from the speakers grew deafening, blending into a low, guttural growl. Then he appeared. A towering figure, featureless except for glowing white eyes, stood at the end of the hallway. Its elongated fingers scraped against the walls, leaving behind black, oozing streaks. Jake's mind screamed at him to move, but his body refused. The thing opened its mouth. A horrible, distorted sound filled the room, like hundreds of voices crying out at once. Jake snapped out of his paralysis. He sprinted toward the window, smashing through the glass just as the figure lunged. Jake hit the ground hard, pain shooting up his arm. He scrambled to his feet, glancing back at the station. The lights inside flickered violently, the red glow from the transmission tower intensifying. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went dark. The station was silent again. Shaking, Jake pulled out his phone and checked the time. 12:01 a.m. He didn't wait. He ran. The next morning, he returned with the police. The station was exactly as it had been before. Dark, abandoned, lifeless. There was no sign of the red glow, the entity, or the strange recordings. The officers dismissed his story as exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But as Jake stood outside the station, he noticed something chilling. His car radio, set to a random FM station, suddenly changed frequencies on its own. The static cleared. A familiar voice spoke. "Jake, we're still waiting." The radio went silent. Jake turned and walked away, vowing never to return. But deep down, he knew. The station was still listening. The signal that shouldn't exist. Derek Hayes had spent years chasing forgotten frequencies. As a radio enthusiast and former journalist, he had a passion for tracking down mysterious signals, those rogue transmissions that appeared without explanation, often tied to urban legends and conspiracy theories. But nothing had ever unsettled him quite like this. It started with an anonymous tip in an online forum. Someone claimed to have picked up a dead frequency, a station that was supposed to be defunct for decades. They described distorted voices, eerie music, and something that sounded like a distress call. The station? WXRX, 103.6. Derek had checked the records. WXRX had shut down in 1998 after a fire destroyed its broadcast tower and killed the station's entire night crew. No one had broadcasted on that frequency since. At least, no one was supposed to. Now, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, headphones pressed tight to his ears, Derek turned the dial of his old shortwave radio to 103.6 FM. Static hissed through the speakers. Then, beneath the noise, something else emerged. A voice. "Can you hear me?" Derek froze. The voice was faint, distorted, as if coming from somewhere far away. But what made his blood run cold was the fact that the voice sounded desperate, like it was trapped. Derek scrambled for his recording equipment. If this was real, he needed proof. He adjusted the frequency, amplifying the signal. "Please, if someone can hear this, I don't know where I am." The voice crackled, interrupted by bursts of static. It sounded male, mid-30s, frightened. Derek leaned closer to the radio. "Who are you?" he asked, knowing the transmission was likely one way. A long silence. Then, "I think I'm in the station. But something is wrong. I don't remember how I got here." Derek's stomach twisted. This had to be a hoax, right? Some elaborate ARG. Then another sound, layered beneath the voice, a low, guttural breathing. "Oh God, he's here." The transmission cut out. Derek yanked off his headphones, his pulse hammering. The room felt suffocatingly silent. He rewound the recording, replaying it. The static, the voice, and then the breathing. Something wasn't right. He had to find out where the signal was coming from. The next day, Derek drove out to the ruins of WXRX. The old station sat deep in the woods, its structure crumbling from years of neglect. Graffiti covered the outer walls, and the collapsed transmission tower lay tangled in the undergrowth. But something was off. His radio was still picking up the signal. If the station had burned down, what was broadcasting? Derek stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. The smell of ash and mildew filled the air. Old broadcasting equipment sat rusting in the control room, untouched for decades. Then something caught his eye. A microphone sat in the center of the desk, perfectly clean, as if someone had been using it. A chilling realization gripped him. What if the voice he heard wasn't coming from a broadcast, but from here? His phone buzzed, a new message from an unknown number. It was an audio file. With shaking hands, he pressed play. The same voice from the radio whispered through his speaker. "Derek, why did you come?" The air grew thick. Derek's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his journalist's curiosity held him in place. He turned on his recorder. "Who are you?" he asked aloud. Silence. Then the radio switched on by itself. A garbled transmission filled the room, voices overlapping in an incomprehensible mess. Then, one voice stood out. "Derek, you need to leave. He's watching." The lights flickered, and then the room wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, motionless, its face hidden in the shadows. Derek stumbled backward. His breath came in ragged gasps as the radio crackled louder. Then, the whispering started. Not from the radio, from inside the room. He turned, and for the briefest moment, he saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures standing in the corners of the station, watching him. Then, darkness. Chapter 5. The Final Broadcast. When Derek woke up, he was sitting at the broadcasting desk. The station was powered on. The on-air light glowed red. The microphone in front of him crackled. "Welcome to WXRX, Derek." "It's your turn now." His own voice. Derek bolted to his feet, his mind reeling. His phone was gone, his car keys missing, the doors locked. Outside, The radio tower was standing again. Its red light pulsed against the night sky. The radio crackled. And then he heard the next caller, a new voice, terrified. "Hello? Is someone there? I don't know where I am." Derek's blood ran cold. The cycle had begun again. Epilogue. The signal never dies. Days passed. Weeks. No one ever found Derek Hayes. His apartment remained untouched, his belongings gathering dust. But late at night, across forgotten frequencies, some listeners claimed to hear his voice. "This is Derek Hayes. If you can hear me, run." And beneath the static, the sound of breathing,